We may be outmatched here, but we have the favor of Ares, something our foes utterly lack. They are the sweepings of the farmyard, dust and chaff to a man. Therefore, be confident and make ready.
Hello and welcome to Historic Games and Such. Today we'll be chatting about the March of the 10,000 with Rome Total War II in the background, hopefully depicting the story I tell a little bit better. If you watched my video on the historic misconceptions of ancient Sparta, I talk about how the Spartans were not even the greatest soldiers of their time, and I used the March of the 10,000 as an example of that, and so I thought I would make a full video on that today. In 401 BCE, Cyrus the Younger, a Persian prince, hired about 10,000 heavy Greek hoplites to wage war against his brother, Artaxerxes. Now, these Greek hoplites did come from all over Greece, but the majority, about half, came from Arcadia. The soldiers that I argue were the greatest soldiers of the ancient Greek era. Arcadia was a very mountainous / hilly area of Greek just north of Sparta, and they were famous for having mercenaries. Because of their landscape, they couldn't really have large cities or be able to create big sprawling fields of crops, so the majority of the work for men was either goat herders or mercenaries, meaning that these soldiers that were hired into Persia were extremely highly trained and had fought very often. The expedition of the 10,000 was recorded down in history by Xenophon, a quite famous Athenian historian, philosopher, and military tactician, and he was actually there in the March of the 10,000 as a soldier and became one of the leaders and generals of the army of the 10,000. These men were hired by Cyrus the Younger because in ancient Persia, it was somewhat common to see that when a king died, the sons would sometimes wage war against each other in order to take the throne. Now, Cyrus the Younger's brother, Artaxerxes, had beat him to the capital and claimed the throne, so Cyrus the Younger hired a bunch of mercenaries and gathered a rebel army to then fight his brother. And his primary force in this rebel army was the 10,000 Greek hoplites. And he wanted them positioned in the center because it was common for Persian military tactics to have the king or the leader in the center, and he wanted to have his strongest unit be the one attacking his brother's strongest unit and hopefully be able to kill or capture his brother. However, the leader of the 10,000 was a Spartan general, and in Greek phalanxes, and especially in Sparta, it was a thing of honor to be located in the front right rank of the line of the army, because this was the most dangerous position, and it was the one that required the most confidence in the military general to hold the line, because the shields were worn on the left side, and so the right side was a little more exposed, so the very furthest right person was actually pretty exposed and not very well covered behind the shield wall. And so the Spartan general wanted the honor of holding that position and went against Cyrus the Younger's orders and had his men positioned in the front right rank. And so that kind of shows how the Greek hoplites were so powerful that they could just disobey orders from the man who hired them and was hoping to become king of all Persia, which at the time was way larger and way more powerful than all of Greece, let alone just Sparta. Once the armies met at the Battle of Cunaxa, the meeting of the two great armies, the Greek hoplites charged forward along with their Persian counterparts and allies, and they actually routed their opponents by intimidation alone at first, before they even got within range of the Greek peltasts that were included with the hoplites. The Persian opponents turned and ran away from them. They continued after them and met back up and actually engaged in combat and completely dominated the fight, routing them again. So between being able to win 2 battles in this war at Canoxa, the Xenophon says that only 1 Greek soldier was injured, let alone actually killed. Xenophon states no Greeks were lost in this first fight. Meanwhile, while the Greeks were fighting, Cyrus the Younger caught a javelin with his internal organs, and the entire Persian rebel army saw this and fled. They completely ran away and seceded their defeat. Well, the Greeks didn't know that their allies were defeated and fled from the battle. They just kept fighting and winning and fighting and winning. And eventually they did realize that they were alone, but by this time the Persians had already burned and sacked their little camp that they had. So they were in the middle of Persia, which is all hostile territory, surrounded with no food, no allies. The Persians, Xenophon says they had about 100,000 troops. More likely it was like 20 or 30,000, but they were definitely outnumbered by a lot. So the Persian army had a plethora of types of soldiers. They had heavy shield and spearmen like the Greek hoplites. They had heavy swordsmen. They had skirmishers. They had archers, light and heavy cavalry. They had all these different types of soldiers. And so to organize them, to position them correctly on the battlefield, to have them maneuvering around each other and having the correct types of units engage in the correct types of battles that they wanted them to engage in, the generals were extremely important in the Persian military. Without them, it would be a complete mess, and the army would not be capable of doing hardly any damage. And so the Persians asked the Greeks to send them their 20 or so generals to then negotiate peace and safe travel back to Greece. Well, the Greeks agreed to this, and once the 20 or so generals were in the Persian hands, they were immediately decapitated. And the Persians believed that, hey, this way they won't have leadership, they're going to be scared, they're going to run away. If they do decide to fight, they're going to be completely useless in battle because they no longer have their generals, right? Well, a Greek phalanx, a hoplite phalanx, it's a shield wall that walks forward and stabs any and all things in front of it. The general stands in that front right corner, that most dangerous position, to hold the line and make sure that no one else runs away. He personally takes on the most dangerous spot to show his men that he believes they can win. And then also he calls out the marching cadence to make sure everyone stays at the same speed. That doesn't require a whole lot of strategy to be confident and call out the cadence in which you're walking. It's not super complex. Meaning the Greeks just promoted another 20 or so guys to be their new generals, and then they just continued fighting. Xenophon, the Athenian philosopher, historian, is one of those that was promoted then to being a general, along with a few Spartans and a few other Greeks that were then promoted to these positions. Well, so they're surrounded. They're thousands of miles away from any neutral or friendly territory. And so what do? They could surrender, or they could walk back to Greece from the middle of Persia. And that's ultimately what they decide to do. They decide to just walk all the way back without food or supplies or allies, while being completely surrounded by hostiles. They just begin walking, and the Persians were almost helpless to stop them. for the first many, many days, they were just constantly being harassed by Persian horse skirmishers who were throwing javelins, shooting arrows at them, and then Xenophon waited until one day they got particularly close. He says within just a few yards of their army. And he put a bunch of the Greek peltists, their javelin throwers, on horseback and charged the lines and completely routed the Persian skirmishers and was able to stop that. Well, so they keep walking, being followed by the entire Persian army until they reach a particularly wide river. Now, they don't have a very fast way to cross this river, no safe way to do it with an army right on their tails. They were trying to think of the craziest schemes to get across this river, including stuffing dead animals with hay, floating them on the river, and then throwing soil on top of it to make it less slippery and walking across. One of the issues there would be that they didn't have any animals to kill and stuff because, again, they had no supplies. And so they just turn around and face the Persian army. And the Persians don't attempt to engage in battle because they know that there's going to be massive casualties if they just charge into a hoplite phalanx of these Arcadians and other Greek hoplites. And eventually they're able to wait it out, work around it, and get across the river and make it, luckily, to some mountainous terrain in northern Persia that the Persians did not control. Local tribes that hated the Persians controlled it. Less luckily, those tribesmen also hated Greeks. And so now they're surrounded by enemies again, but this time they're not tired. Haven't been chasing these Greeks. They're well fed in their home territory in this mountainous terrain, and they begin raining rocks and arrows and javelins on these Greek soldiers. And they just keep walking, because what else can they do at this point? They walk through this mountainous terrain. Eventually, they end up making a peace agreement with these tribesmen right as they're about to leave the territory, of course, and they're entering into a new area that they made a alliance with the next one that the 10,000 would have to eventually walk through to join their armies together and meet them in combat just to put an end to these Greek mercenaries storming through Persia trying to get back home. The combined efforts of these two new areas that were also friends with Persia, so they had Persian reinforcements. The combined effort killed about 500 Greeks of the 10,000, hardly putting a dent in the army. They continue walking through these new areas, getting to the Black Sea and a friendlier area where they take one of the Spartan generals, and then he sails off to go to a Spartan-controlled port on the Black Sea to arrange transportation via ships for the army. However, when he makes it to friendly territory, he decides to not go back to hostile lands and just sends a messenger saying, hey, I'll pay you guys what I owe you if you make it back out alive, knowing full well that they're probably not going to be able to make it the rest of the way out of Persia without supplies and anything else. So the 10,000 continue to march and march. In Syria, the Arcadian general actually abandons his men and takes off running for allied territory. And so then his about 4,000 Arcadian troops join up under one of the Spartan generals. And then they keep marching. Eventually, they march over 3,000 miles, reaching friendly territory in Ionia, modern-day Western Turkey. Over this 2 years of marching in hostile territory, completely alone, without supplies, The original 10,400 about Greeks, 6,000 of them made it back to Greece. They lost less than half that they started with. Over 2 years of constant combat, being surrounded by one of the largest militaries in the known ancient world. So, like, can this story please be made into a movie? It's inspired a few novels here and there, like little bits and parts, but it's never been brought to the big screen, at least under my knowledge. And it would be such a cool movie, or even like TV show, or at least like a 3-part series marathon movie like Lord of the Rings or something. I don't know. I think it's really, really cool. Anyway, if you liked the video, like the video, subscribe, and bye!